Imagine the big house kitchen before dawn, wood smoke braided with the sweet sting of lye, a cast iron kettle breathing heat against your shins. For many months, you count the bell strokes, learn the fire's moods, and note where ash turns orange. The quiet ledger on the pantry shelf pretends everything balances until you see what it hides. This is the unflinching story of Eliza Carter, Edgefield District, South Carolina, 1854. Before we dive in, please subscribe if you like my exclusive investigation. A century and a half later, on October 3, 2018, in Columbia, South Carolina, a historian released a paper tracing coroner inquests and plantation inventories from the Edgefield District. In a quiet reading room, a student turned a page and found an image the records did not know how to name. A ledger leaf crimped at the edge into a black, glassy blister, as if a tongue of vitrified fire had licked it and stayed. The handwriting nearby listed losses and claims, but a phrase recurred in cramped ink: "Injury by molten." A captioned photograph of that puckered paper and the accompanying footnotes on a night of ash and iron pulled a buried event into present light. One image, one brittle curve of slag fused to accounts, became the opening lens for a massacre reduced, in its own time, to a property dispute. The plantation that Ledger once ruled sat on a slope above Stevens Creek, where a cotton gin, a smithy bench, and a long shed of seed crates lined the yard like teeth. The main house faced east to catch first light on its clappered face. A bell hung from a cedar frame beside the gin house, rung at sunup, noon, sundown, and during storms when hands were ordered inside. Surveillance was rhythm, not spectacle. The overseer's horse circling the lanes after dark. The housekeeper's tally of soap and candles. A lock rotated each week among 3 doors so no one knew which cache would be checked. At night, the smithy kept its embers banking under sand, a habit that made the next morning's kindling easy, but also left the shop smelling faintly of heat even when nothing glowed. Eliza Carter moved inside those beats like someone reading a code. She was slight, quick in wrists, and by 15 had learned every station the house would allow: laundry, pantry, chamber hearths, and the kitchen where she preferred to stand, hidden in steam. She watched iron the way others watched people. She learned how fat spattered against seasoned cast iron could leave a trace that told you more than a tongue would: what temperature, what patience, what risk. At the smithy door, under the eye of an old farrier who needed nimble hands for bellows, she learned the language of heat by listening. The low breath of coals, the crackle that meant trouble. She memorized the path from fire to sand pit to quench barrel and tested, in stolen moments, how much weight a ladle could carry before an arm shook. Her private ritual was small and exacting. Each morning, before the bell, she placed her palm above the stove, counted slow to 10, and insisted on perfect level breath. Control was the one thing she could own. Her wound had no single scene. It was a sedimentary thing layered by years. A mother who went to the fields and did not return from a fevered autumn. A brother sold in a winter when debts came due, and an overseer took pride in bargaining. A whip crack that left the kitchen silent for a week because silence disobeyed less than tears. The master's harms were often bureaucratic, not spectacular. He sat at the small desk that faced the pantry window and traded names for credits, leaving ink pools where his pen hesitated over which child to count as a replacement for a man sent away. Eliza was made to carry the ledger from that desk to the office chest inside the bedroom, a path measured deliberately to remind her of its power. When the page edges blackened against a candle one evening and the housekeeper snapped, Eliza recorded the lines of scorn, not the words, and added them to a longer ledger she kept in memory. The antagonists gathered like weather. Nathaniel Barrow, master by inheritance and habit, wore vice like a ring on the hand that never seemed to stain. He preferred control through arithmetic. A deduction here, a tally there. The promise of reward always deferred to the next season. His weakness was vanity. He believed order meant safety, and anything that appeared in a column could not strike him from a shadow. Caleb Reeves, the overseer, was tall and prone to demonstrating strength when breath would have served. He made lists of infractions, attached to rations, and taught his dogs to sit at the sound of a bell so that they and the humans obeyed the same metal tongue. His weakness was that he trusted the animals more than his own reading. He missed the sentences that did not bark. Lydia Pike, the housekeeper brought as a cousin from Augusta, ran the pantry with piety and control. She counted candles and peered into pots, a ruler of small measures whose dominion ended at the threshold of the smithy, where her fear of sparks kept her distance. Her weakness was that she believed fire belonged only to men, and would not look for a woman's hand on a bellows. There were others with smaller gravities. Moses, the driver, who had learned to bend to winds to keep others from breaking. Jonas, a boy who kept the ash buckets emptied and knew by sight which locks were rusting faster than keys. A neighbor's hog that had learned to bump open the yard gate with its snout and wander at dusk, leaving prints that drew curses and suspicion toward the wrong feet. Eliza watched them all, not as enemies, but as moving parts in a system that could be changed if willingly blind forces were made to collide. Artifacts waited for uses they had not yet known. A charred ledger corner, blistered on a winter night when a candle leaned too close, proof that a margin could burn faster than a calculation could be completed. A decoy key ring assembled from broken teeth and flattened nails, hidden in a crack behind the pantry shelf where Eliza's fingers had once found a mouse nest and decided to replace fear with purpose. A rusted lock on the smithy side door that Caleb meant to fix every week but never did, because no one challenged a habit that had not yet failed publicly. A fig tree behind the kitchen where children hid to steal late fruit. Its roots lifted the packed earth, creating a vein of soft soil that held footprints longer than the rest of the yard. A spare ladle hammered from bent iron, too crude for table service but stronger than any meant for soup. Weather wrote its own stakes. That summer the storms came from the west with sudden dry lightning that split trees but left no rain to tamp the dust. Heat made tempers short. It also made iron flow easier. In August, Nathaniel announced a new pressing schedule for cotton to impress a visitor who promised to talk up Barrow Gin on his circuit. It meant the bell would ring long after sundown and the smithy would be kept primed in case of a gear fracture. It also meant that, for the first time in months, the master would sleep in the downstairs room near his office to be close to the yard at dawn. Eliza was the one assigned to bank the coals longer and keep the kettle steaming for his midnight drafts of spiced milk. Control through arithmetic had placed him exactly where heat and calculation could meet. In the weeks before that schedule took hold, Eliza practiced tasks no one noticed. She moved water from the quench barrel to smaller buckets and timed how many steps could be taken before a surface trembled. She traded a heel of bread to Jonas in exchange for the key to the scrap chest where discarded metal waited. Together they argued without words, his head tilted toward caution, hers toward resolve, and the key found its way back to its nail before Caleb's next circle. She watched the hog at dusk and learned the gate's exact swing so the creak could be masked with a last-minute oiling from the kitchen's pork fat jar. She learned the weight of silence at different hours and where the dogs lay when no one shouted. She memorized the sound of Lydia's slippers in the pantry and how long it took that woman to count candles, always twice. If there is a moment when revenge becomes not a feeling but a method, it came one late afternoon when Eliza lifted the decoy key ring and pressed its cold teeth into her palm, hard enough to leave a map. The marks felt like proof that something meant to open could also cut. She stood under the fig tree and watched two children fight over a wasp-stung fruit, then settle when a third child split it fair. The settlement was simple. Halves, offered without words. In that small justice, she saw a blueprint for a larger correction she did not name. She looked past the kitchen to the smithy door and pictured the ladle, the sand pit, the path to the house with its new downstairs bed. The pieces existed. The arithmetic could be made to add to something other than profit. A flaw hovered, the kind that ruins plans that mistake fire for certainty. In the last week of August, Caleb changed the dog rotation, tying the youngest hound closer to the house to harden its training. The chain's new radius overlapped the path Eliza would need at night. She adjusted the kitchen scraps to bias the animal toward sleeping after sundown, setting aside bones for a slow gnaw at twilight and soaking them so scent would not carry too far. She reminded herself that every plan breaks on contact with a living thing, and that adaptation is a kind of heat too. The unexpected witness took shape in the form of Jonas, who grew taller that summer and had the habit of appearing where ash drifted thickest. He watched Eliza with a boy's absorbing gaze, and once handed her a rag for her smoke-stung eyes. She accepted and told him nothing, but his presence forced her to account for a gaze she did not control. She began leaving small errors in her routines for him to find. A slightly misaligned poker on the hearthstones, a bucket handle turned inward instead of outward, so that if he was questioned, he would report honest oddities that pointed nowhere fatal. She did not want a child's truth to become a gallows. By the time the visitor arrived to tour the gin house, the grounds had been made handsome but brittle, pathways swept, oil lamps polished, door locks hastily rubbed with tallow that did not last in heat. Nathaniel paced between office and yard with a fresh shirt and the ledger's new section for anticipated yields. Lydia stocked the pantry with extra spices as if aroma could bind a page. Caleb walked the dogs in a figure 8 to demonstrate discipline. And in the smithy, under sand that looked inert, coals banked toward a red that could be coaxed awake with a few steady breaths. The night before the demonstration, a thunderhead rose and veered, leaving only a smear of heat and light over the ridge. The bell rang for evening, then for final checks, then for Caleb's circuit. It would ring again at midnight for the press test. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and set the kettle to simmer in a way that would keep flavor without boiling. She moved the crude ladle from the shadow to the bench's edge, a place no one but she would look. She oiled the yard gate hinges with a thumb of fat and turned the decoy keyring in her apron pocket until the iron warmed to body temperature, making it less likely to clink against itself. When the household quieted and the daylight seeped out of the yard, the ticking signal declared itself. One long pull on the bell rope at midnight to summon hands to the press. It would cover any clatter, it would fix all eyes on the gin house. The master, wanting to wake near the action, had already shifted to the downstairs bed, its window propped for breeze that would carry the scent of hot iron across the grass. In the pantry, the ledger lay under its cloth unafraid. In the smithy, under the sand, a breath away from orange, slept a river waiting for a hand. The bell's midnight pull throbbed across the yard like a length of wire plucked and held. The gin house lanterns went up first, squares of weak light puncturing the dark. In the smithy, Eliza lifted the sand with the shovel's flat edge and felt heat climb her forearms before the glow surfaced. She fed the coals, bellows slow and even, until the color turned from dull cherry to the white at the center that makes iron submit. The crude ladle, its bowl hammered from scrap, warmed along the handle as she held it near the bed of coals to ward off shock. She kept the quench barrel behind her left knee, not for cooling metal but for nerve. Water as a thought of safety in a room designed for risk. Set piece 1 began on the anvil face, though no hammer rose. Eliza dragged a runnel through the banked coals to build a channel of heat, the way the farrier once taught her to coax a stubborn temper. She scooped until the ladle's lip kissed the white heat, and a slow pour crept into the bowl. The weight arrived not all at once but as a growing tremor in her wrist, iron thickening as it met cooler air. She counted breaths as she lifted, not numbers but the spaces between them, and turned toward the door where the rusted lock hung on the inside bar. It stuck, as always, at the first lift. She leaned the ladle's handle into the crook of her elbow, freed her hand, and shoved the bar with the heel of her palm until it gave. One flaw revealed itself in the small hiss from the ladle's rim. She had warmed the bowl, not the collar, and the seam sang a warning. She lowered the ladle to rest against the doorframe and breathed until the sound ceased. Outside, set piece 2 waited in open ground. The yard's dirt was hard where feet had packed it, but the vein beneath the fig tree held softness like memory. Eliza stepped around it to avoid prints that would read too easily at dawn. The bell still called hands to the press, and bodies ran toward the gin house, giving her a corridor of emptiness where crowd would have been. The neighbor's hog chose that moment to shoulder through the oiled gate, snout testing the hinges she had quieted. It snorted, a wet, curious sound, and the youngest hound lifted its head, chain tinkling against its ring. The dog's bark came quick, the kind that sharpens a man's eye. Eliza neither rushed nor froze. She angled her body so the ladle's glow pointed away from the house, set the bowl briefly atop the ash bucket outside the pantry to rest her arm, and drew from her apron the soaked bone she had hidden at dusk. A clean loft of the wrist sent it skittering into shadow near the smokehouse. The dog's bark turned downward to a gnawing whine. The chain went slack. The barracks breathed behind her, a long, low shape under the moon's thin light. In set piece 3, the lookout she had not asked for but counted on emerged. Jonas, barefoot, standing in the shadow of the steps, eyes reflecting the smithy's ghost light still clinging to her hands. He did not move. She had left him a story to tell if anyone asked. The misaligned poker, the inward-turned bucket handle, and now he stood writing his own. A woman crossing the yard with a kitchen bucket, not a smith's ladle. She shifted the tool's silhouette with a folded cloth draped over its bowl like a towel. The cloth smoked at the seam, but from distance it read as water duty, not fire. The pantry took her next. Set piece 4 hinged on quiet. Lydia's slippers had gone silent an hour earlier. The woman's tidiness meant every jar sat label forward, every candle stub aligned. Eliza stepped into that order and used it against itself. She slid the decoy keyring from her apron and left it halfway behind the flower crocks, teeth glinting like a dropped mistake. If the housekeeper woke and came to count candles against rations, the false keys would invite a small investigation that would end at the pantry shelf, not the bedroom threshold. Eliza set the ladle's rim into the croc's lip for a breath, letting the alibi hold the weight, then lifted again and passed through the office where the ledger lay under its cloth. The iron's heat licked the cloth's edge and curled it an eyelash's width. A smell like singed hair rose and vanished. On the desk, the master's pen rested in its groove as if it were a plow idled at twilight. She felt the impulse to touch the charred corner of the ledger, a superstition that contact with past fire could bless the present, and kept her hand away. Touch leaves oil, oil leaves story. The bedroom door was the smallest threshold and the largest argument. She set the ladle on the floorboards, knelt, and pressed 2 fingers to the gap beneath the door. Air moved outward. a slow exhale from a room warmer than the hallway. The window had been propped, as expected. A draft would carry smell away from her, not toward her. She pushed the door, slow enough that the latch tongue slid along the strike plate without a click. Inside, the scene resolved like a daguerreotype. Bed against the far wall, pillow turned toward the open window, a glass on the small table, and the master's face in profile, lit by the low lamplight that Lydia had left to flatter household and visitor alike. The lamp that made the room handsome now made it treacherous. Light would render any movement legible to a watcher. She had planned for darkness. The oversight was hers. The countermove came from the hall. Caleb's boots, an uneven rhythm from an old ankle injury, crossing the far boards as he checked doors out of habit rather than suspicion. The dog's earlier bark had rinsed him with caution. Eliza lifted the ladle and moved along the wall where lamplight thinned. If the overseer chose the pantry next, the decoy keys would keep him busy. If he chose the office, the singe at the ledger's cloth would betray heat. She did not linger over if. The plan had room for only one temperature now. Set piece 5 closed the loop. She stepped to the bedside, the window breeze brushing the sweat on her forearms into cold, and lifted the ladle high enough that the iron skin thinned, low enough that splash would be controlled. She had tested viscosity by ear in the smithy. Now she read it by smell and weight. The bowl tilted. The first thread of glowing metal met skin and hissed like rain on a candle. Iron does not splash like water. It sheets, heavy and adhesive, finding hollows and edges, becoming mask where it lands. The lamp guttered as heat lifted air. The bed jerked with life becoming pain. She kept the pour steady, not a toss, because arcs leave patterns that the eye can track across a room. A steady sheet reads as gravity, not aim. The pillow smoked. The window drew heat outward. The iron cooled to a dull, wrinkled black at the margin, while the center clung with a color that names fail. Sound answered sound. The master thrashed, a violent arithmetic of limbs that struck the table and sent the glass rolling. It found the lamp's base. Oil lifted to lip, hesitated, then spilled. Flame crawled along the plank, turned under the table and reached the bed tick where dust had waited for a spark. Eliza had calculated for a burn, not a blaze. The room corrected her. The smoke's first draft rose up the window and then, with a shift in the breeze, pushed back into the hall. Adaptation became the only method. She turned from the bed toward the office, where the ledger lay in its shroud. A pure escape would leave that book intact to write a future the same as the past. A correction would target the columns that converted people to yield. She stepped through the doorway as the hall filled with a low sheet of smoke and lifted the lamp's second flame from the wall sconce with a twist of cloth. She exposed the ledger's corner and held the flame against the blistered margin where the winter's accident had left a scar. Paper remembers heat. It took quickly. The first edge curled, then ran along the line where losses had been written in a careful hand. She left the rest to take care of itself. Fire, once convinced, does not ask for permission. Behind her, boots struck the hall. Caleb shouted without words, a sound that turned the barracks into movement. The older hound bayed, the younger snarled short and sharp. Moses, roused by smell and noise, began steering bodies away from the main house toward the yard, a herd sense applied to people to keep panic from feeding flame. Eliza slid along the office wall, past the pantry where the decoy keys threw small glints under the candle shelf, and reached the kitchen. There, the final set piece waited at the threshold she knew best. The kitchen held its own fire, banked low. She lifted the kettle to mask the smell that clung to her, spilled milk on the hearthstone to create a rival odor, and dragged the ash bucket across the floorboards to overlay the prints from the smithy. She took the back step down into the yard and moved toward the fig tree, where the soft soil would hold an honest trail unless she erased it. She walked deliberately through that patch and then doubled back along the packed path, turning her own prints into a muddle anyone might have made during the alarm. At the gate, the hog had abandoned its bone. She nudged it with her foot deeper into shadow so that a dog, if loosed, would find it and stay. The press crew, drawn by Belle and then by Smoke, clustered at the gin house. Lydia flapped a cloth at the doorway of the main house, as if air could push flame backward. Nathaniel's visitor, pale in the yard lanterns, looked at the burning room and at his own carriage as if one might cancel the other. Caleb, seeing a figure near the kitchen step, started toward Eliza, and then veered at the sight of Jonas, who had taken 2 steps into the light and then stopped, frozen by the blaze and by the sudden width of adult fear. Eliza used that angle. Concern always turns a man's body, and slipped behind the smokehouse toward the route path that found the swamp trail. She had scouted it in daylight when the housekeeper sent her for herbs and remembered every route that tripped a foot unprepared. A last counterforce rose with the weather. The dry lightning that had stalked the ridge returned without rain, puncturing the dark with white that showed every moving body in split frames. For an instant, Eliza's shape printed itself against the smokehouse wall in stark silhouette. A militiaman who had slept in the big house guest room for Nathaniel's demonstration, an early arrival with a taste for proximity, caught the glimpse and shouted the kind of word that makes men run. Eliza felt the plan tear along a seam she had not stitched, and answered by slowing, not sprinting. Runners draw pursuit. Workers moving with purpose look like help. She bent, lifted a second ash bucket from the smokehouse corner, and trotted toward the well as if to fetch water like the others. The militiaman's eye landed past her on the open bedroom window, where flame had begun to chew the sash. The irreversible moment had already happened. Iron had met flesh. Ledger had taken fire. A house that believed itself safe by arithmetic had learned another kind of sum. But commitment has its own threshold. Eliza crossed it when she stepped off the packed yard path into the brush toward the swamp trail, ash bucket in hand as alibi, then left it beneath a loblolly pine to mark a wrong story for any who would follow. She felt the ground change underfoot. From beaten earth to leaf rot to the damp, that means a body has to learn new steps. Behind her, bell and shouting tangled. Ahead, frogs called from black water. The press would not run by dawn. The visitor's report would change from yield to incident, and a woman who had learned the language of heat by listening moved into a night where sound was more useful than light. Dawn made the yard look honest again, and that was its first lie. Smoke thinned into a pale smear above the cedar bell frame. The bedroom window that had breathed flame toward the night now showed a rim of soot like coal. Lydia Pike found the bed first, edging past Caleb's arm as he shouldered a bucket to the threshold. The mattress was a scored moonscape, charred at the edges, a caved trough where heat had eaten through ticking and husk. Nathaniel Barrow was not a body to be lifted, but a problem to be stabilized. Face turned toward the window, features hidden beneath a stiff new mask the color of old iron. He lay at an angle that told its own sequence. Startled to the left, struck in the instant between sleep and intent, pinned by pain into stillness that had saved his lungs from too much smoke. One pillow was black glass crushed into burlap. The other, unstained, had been shoved to the floor by blind motion. The lamp base lay sideways against an oval of oil that had burned itself out, leaving a brown halo like a tide line. Evidence spoke in low register. On the plank floor, a scatter of cooled droplets beaded toward the chair where the glass had rolled. Eliza had work to pour, not fling, but metal still leaves punctuation. The pattern read as a thin ellipse, not an arc. Annie Smith would see temperament, not accident. At the office threshold, the ledger cloth had failed along the old winter blister and curled back like bark. Inside, the first pages of the new season's yield had blackened in waves. The margins that recorded deductions and punishments were gone entirely, the burn running there as if guided. A faint line on the wall, up near shoulder height, showed where a second flame had licked before dying, too small to become story on its own. In the pantry, false keys glinted behind the flour, discovered by Lydia's blind reach for calm habit. She raised them and then lowered them again, unsettled by proof that control had been rehearsed without her. Outside, the fig tree told as well. In the softened soil beneath its shade, prints lay in conflicting conversation, the splay of children's narrow feet from earlier days, the deep round of a hog's trotters cutting the edge, the angled heel and forefoot of an adult who had stepped full into the soft and then abandoned the line to rejoin the packed path. A single ash smear crossed the veining roots, a signal someone had carried a bucket here and then elsewhere. Near the smokehouse, an ash bucket leaned upright under a loblolly, dry inside, ringed at its lip with the faintest trace of condensed vapor. Scent told what sight did not. Somewhere in the run between smithy and bed, hot metal had paused against fat, flour, and cloth. Into the forged silence of morning, the dogs added their own notes. The younger hound gnawed a bone soaked at dusk. The chain showed scuffed earth where it had jerked toward the smokehouse and then settled. The first formal gaze arrived with the coroner just after mid-morning, summoned by a militiaman who had slept in the guest room for the planned demonstration and now found himself writing a different report. On the parlor table, beneath portraits that made men look permanent, a linen sheet received objects lifted from the scene. The cooled iron beads were arranged by size in a row. The ladle was not among them. The overseer swore he had inventory of all smithy tools. The farrier, when asked, could only say a spare existed once for scrap, too crude for table, but sound for heat. A swatch from the ledger cloth was placed beside the beads. Its edge was glassed where fire had run fast, a miniature version of the modern photograph that would one day travel through a university archive. Into the record went timings drawn from ears rather than clocks. The midnight bell pull, the quick shout in the hall, the thunderhead's stuttering light that froze bodies into silhouettes as if wanting to be eyewitnesses. A coroner's jury gathered that afternoon in the main house, not at the courthouse, because a man of property had been injured on his own bed, and there was ritual value in keeping inquiry under his roof. The room smelled of vinegar and soap. 6 local men leaned forward to hear Caleb describe the lamp tipped by a rolling glass, and Lydia insist on an unseen hand she called mischief for lack of a calmer word. Moses, steady as always, steered testimony away from panic. Jonas, called up from the yard and asked to account for his steps, repeated details planted for him to find. A hearth poker left misaligned, an ash bucket handle turned inward instead of out. He said he saw a woman crossing with a covered bucket toward the well, and then corrected himself to say he could not swear it was water. The phrase joined the record as a useful vagueness. No one mentioned a hog. The euphemisms arrived as they always did when a system preferred not to rename itself. What had happened in the bedroom became, in ink, an instance of incendiarism rather than revenge. The iron that had sheathed a face was described as molten substance, as if it had fallen from the sky. The charred ledger pages were not loss of proof, but alteration of accounts, a phrase that made arithmetic sound like a dress that could be mended. The jury did not rule a death because there was none yet. They advised vigilance, more locks, and a temporary posting of militia at the smithy after hours until the yard remembered obedience. On the second morning, Nathaniel Barrow was moved to the front parlor where windows opened wide. Shutters made shade across the new mask that would not come off. He existed between breaths, a man who had relied on columns and now lived in seconds. A physician from Augusta, fetched over rough road, smeared ointments that cooled the surface without reaching the harm beneath. The ledgers, salvaged in part, sat nearby, covered by a clean cloth. Lydia kept the pantry door locked and the key in her apron. Caleb walked the dogs in shorter circles and asked the bell rope for order at irregular hours, confusing bodies into readiness. Routine had become theater, an answer staged for fear's appetite. The search unfolded in concentric rings. First, the outbuildings were turned out for the missing ladle. Then the swamp path was probed to the distance of a cautious man's courage. In the first day's heat, boot prints softened and prints of bare feet became indistinct. Near a cypress root where leaf rot held its secrets longer, a smear of dark metal lay tamped into mud like a thumbprint. The overseer called it slag. The farrier, eyes narrowed, said it looked like iron that had cooled too fast on a wet cloth. No one produced the cloth. The ash bucket beneath the loblolly was returned to its corner as if restoring an altar made the god return. The oiled gate hinges, silenced before the night, were given new grease as if late maintenance could rewrite cause. By the end of the week, an institutional script replaced improvisation. Notices went up in town for a runaway woman, age guessed in late teens, name variable, last seen near the gin house. The poster used the word girl to reduce threat and incendiary to inflate caution. A magistrate and a panel of freeholders met in the courthouse room where slave cases were usually heard. The walls kept the cool of old plaster. The hearing recorded an absence rather than a presence, and the record kept the useful phrase from the parlor, "Injury by Moulton." The sheriff's hand wrote strong lines around speculation. A reward was offered for information that did not arrive. Rumor ran faster than patrol. Eliza had crossed into the wet that takes sound and turns it under. The swamp took her in with dragonflies and thin snakes that moved sideways from her path. She traveled by smell and touch more than sight, because the cypress knees could break a shin if the eye insisted on straight lines. A shanty of river people took her for a washerwoman briefly, because ash on a dress reads like labor, not flight. A turpentine camp farther away let her trade hands for bread for a handful of days until questions about scars that were not on her began to make nights smaller. In time, she slid along the savannah toward places that did not take notes on every body passing. Disappearance is a work like any other. It requires practice. In Edgefield, her name became a shape used in threats to children, then an absence used to scold women at the smithy door. Outcomes have paperwork even when they do not have bodies. In late autumn of that year, a plantation inventory listed the household's adjusted value with a blank line where one woman's name had been. The ledger did not write reason. The same book, stripped of burnt pages and stitched with new gatherings, recorded a loss for one damaged bedstead, 2 mattresses, and assorted linens. The entry for medical fees was folded into household expenses. A separate hand, likely Lydia's, cataloged pantry oils and added a new line for lamp covers, metal. Locks were replaced on the smithy and storehouse. A set of keys was kept in the master's desk and another in Caleb's belt. Dogs were fed earlier so they would sleep across midnight. Kitchen routines grew noisier by design. Iron hung where it clanked when moved. Ash buckets were dragged rather than carried to make tracks honest and loud. The echo moved through culture faster than through law. Women were told that a bellows belonged to men. and that curiosity near sand pits was a form of impertinence. A superstition grew against fig trees near kitchens. Their soft soil was said to invite devil feet. A short song among the hands turned the night's events into a riddle that children whispered, trading the word for iron with a word for rain so that adults could not forbid it easily. In town, the press used language that kept white readers calm. The story of a face remade by heat became a note about fire hazards at harvest time. Insurance men widened their inquiry into lamps. A state committee bemoaned the danger of smithies kept near domestic rooms, which was as far as it could go without naming caste. Years later, Jonas, grown to a man who kept the gin running and chose when to be deaf, told his own children a version that reduced heroics and amplified craft. He described a pour that read like gravity and a ledger that burned exactly where it had to. He did not speak Eliza's name, not because he had forgotten it, but because he believed names belong to those who choose to keep them. Moses died without ever having lied about that night, which is not the same as having told it whole. Caleb's dogs learned to ignore bones left at dusk, and he never discovered whether that discipline made him safer or just more tired. Lydia kept the pantry keys in a little bag she wore even to sleep, a gesture that convinced her, if not anyone else. When the century turned and then turned again, the plantation became less field than memory. A road cut the old lane, and a house went down to foundation. The cedar frame that had held the bell rotted and fell. Children pulled iron from the ground to sell as scrap, and sometimes brought home a bead of metal the size of a pea without knowing that it had once sung. In Columbia, when the historian set the blistered ledger leaf under glass, students gathered to breathe the air above it as if heat might rise again. The caption used the phrase copied from the parlor notes, "Injury by Moulton." A footnote named Edgefield District listed a handful of corroborating entries, and then, despite its careful restraint, admitted that the paper had been fused to glassy slag that could have come only from a forge. The photograph of that puckered edge, black, glossy, inexplicable to those who prefer neat endings, traveled into articles and talks. The bell returns at the end because it never stopped. In the archive, a distant chime from a clock tower drifted in through the high windows on the day the student first saw the fused page. The sound was clean, institutional, sure of its purpose. On the land where the bell frame once stood, wind moved through saplings and made a thinner music that still told time if a person listened. The ledger that had posed as order now carried a fault line set by fire, and the fire bore the shape of a hand that learned heat by breath. The story that began at a kitchen's steady normal and declared itself through iron ends where records fail and memory keeps working. Under a fig tree's descendants, in soft soil that still takes prints longer than the rest of the yard, someone kneeling could press a palm into earth and feel a history warm under the surface. Not enough to burn, enough to know.